Hello and welcome to our third documentary as part of the Leeds Opera Story. With thanks to funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund and Leeds City Council, we've been discovering the 300-year history of opera in Leeds, visiting museums and archives to uncover the forgotten artists, companies and operas that have played a significant role in the development of opera in the city. In this episode, we're exploring a milestone moment in the Leeds Opera Story, the first performance of Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle, which took place at Leeds Grand Theatre in 1911. Featuring in this episode is an exclusive interview with someone who knows what it's like to conduct a ring cycle in Leeds, the former music director of Opera North, Richard Farnes. We've also got a new recording of an aria from Das Rhinegold, the first of the 4 operas that make up the ring cycle, as well as a new recording of an aria by Handel that has a special place in the history of opera at Leeds Grand Theatre. Here's Richard Farnes in action conducting the ring cycle in 2016, with perhaps the most famous passage of any opera.
No opera company is going to engage in the process of a ring cycle without thinking very hard first, because it's the sheer scale of the thing. It's the largest project that any opera company, in fact any musical organisation, can undertake. There aren't just the obvious costs of expense, financial considerations, but also it's the sheer organisational complexity of staging the 4 works. And what the danger of that is that if you put on a ring cycle, it affects everything else during your season. Everything else tends to get sort of curtailed or shoved off into the corner because so much energy needs to go into this. I mean, if you can imagine trying to put on a cycle with 4 pretty large scale operas, if you're putting on a cycle together, you know, in a way you'll need 4 casts, a lot of whom sing in more than one of the operas, some of whom sing in 3 of the operas. And so they're all being called into simultaneous rehearsals in different rehearsal rooms. So it's just a logistical complexity that makes it a very significant undertaking.
So, the ring cycle is made up of 4 operas by Richard Wagner: Das Rhinegold, Die Walküre, Siegfried and Götterdämmerung. In brief, it concerns the battle over an all-powerful ring that has the potential to enable its owner to take control over the entire world. It's basically Lord of the Rings, but with music. Following the premiere of the full ring cycle in Germany in 1876, it quickly established its unique reputation as the pinnacle of operatic achievement and ambition. The first Leeds ring cycle was the work primarily of one man, Ernst Denhof. Denhof was a music teacher from Edinburgh who was inspired by the 1908 ring cycle at London's Covent Garden Theatre. With great ambition and talent, Denhof managed to produce the first ring cycle in the UK outside of London, in Edinburgh, in 1910. Buoyed by its success, he developed plans with his newly minted Denhof Opera Company to bring the ring cycle to wider audiences across the UK. In our last episode, we covered the arrival of Gilbert and Sullivan operas in Leeds in 1876 and the growing snobbery from opera fans towards the popularity of light opera and the types of audiences that such frivolous entertainment commanded. The arrival of the ring cycle in Leeds in 1911, therefore, was a marker that Leeds was able to host and find an audience for the greatest heights of dramatic opera. Now, that's not to say that its arrival and success were to be taken for granted. 1 year before the proposed tour to Leeds, Manchester and Glasgow, there was a huge effort to secure enough advanced ticket sales to make the tour financially viable. Without enough guaranteed support from audiences, the tour wouldn't go ahead. And there was a strong moral imperative put upon people of influence to show their backing for the project and, in turn, demonstrate that Leeds was a cultured and highbrow city that could support the significant financial commitment needed to sustain performances of Wagner's Ring Cycle. The 18th of April 1910 Yorkshire Post newspaper, Herbert Thompson, in an article titled Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung in Yorkshire, wrote, "To make it a success, it is obvious that not only Leeds, but the large district of which it is the natural centre, should take an active interest in the event. A prospectus will, it is understood, be issued shortly, but already a very considerable number of people of influence in various parts of the county have signified their sympathy with the scheme and their readiness to support it. So soon as further particulars are available, they will be announced in the Yorkshire Post, and an early response to the appeal thus made will be necessary to enable Mr. Denhoff to secure his principals and make all the necessary arrangements." A date of the 7th of October 1910 was set to try and secure the necessary advance ticket sales, similar to a modern-day subscription concert series. Audiences could make their booking through Mr. Ramsden's shop on Park Row, and the Yorkshire Post continued to implore readers to make their bookings as soon as possible. On the 7th of October, deadline day, the Yorkshire Post announced that the response to the appeal for tickets had been remarkable. However, they couldn't be sure that the £3,500 needed to be raised had been reached, and whether the promoter, Mr. Denhoff, would be able to keep ticket sales open any longer. Ticket prices started at 5 shillings, which was the same price you could buy a ticket to the 1911 FA Cup Final Four between Newcastle United and Bradford City. But it was certainly more than audiences were used to paying to go and see the opera at Leeds Grand Theatre. Charles Manners Opera Company, for example, were selling tickets to their shows for 2 shillings and sixpence in the stalls, and the Yorkshire Post recognised that the prices are, no doubt necessarily, beyond the reach of many of the keenest lovers of Wagner's music. Nevertheless, Mr. Denhoff raised what was required from audiences in Leeds, Manchester and Glasgow to make his project viable. He even included a performance of Strauss's Elektra, which would tour alongside the Ring. The dates were set for the 28th of March to the 1st of April 1911, with Leeds being the first stop on the tour. Denhoff had hired an orchestra of 82 players, most of whom were from his earlier Scottish orchestra, and a cast of leading British singers, many of whom had performed at the Covent Garden Ring in 1908 and in Denhoff's performances in Edinburgh in 1910. The scenery and costumes from the Edinburgh performance, estimated to have cost Denhoff £10,000, were also to be reused for this 1911 tour. Rehearsals were quite lengthy for the time, however, compared to today's standards, they were minimal. Just 2 weeks were allocated to rehearse the 15 hours of the Ring Cycle, and only one of those weeks was with the singers. I asked Richard Farnes about rehearsals for his 2016 Ring Cycle.
Well, we very much in 2016 relied on the fact that we'd done each of the operas separately over 4 separate years previously. I mean, we even then we had weeks and weeks. I mean, I can't remember how many orchestral rehearsals I had, but the orchestral rehearsals alone would have taken 2 weeks, and we'd played them all the pieces within the last sort of 6 years before that. So that, I mean, originally when the company decided to do the operas as separate parts, the idea was to do Rhinegold and Valkyria, the first two, together, because Rhinegold is a little bit shorter than the others. And I said, no, I think we should do it over 4 years, not 3, because I think even doing Rhinegold, which is 2.5 hours of music, and again, a lot of complexity with the cast, I thought that it would be better to devote a separate year to that. So I think, I mean, 2 weeks sounds utterly crazy to me, and completely undoable. And of course, we had another consideration was, of course, that we were touring the piece as well. So we had lots of different venues to take into account.
The chorus was supplemented by local singers from the Leeds Choral Union, who, according to the Musical Times, sang well, and, considering their inexperience of the stage, comported themselves creditably. Performances were conducted by Michael Borling and sung in an English translation by Frederick Jameson. Here's Wotan's Abendlich strahlt der Sonne Auge from Das Rhinegold, sung by Jake Muffett in Jameson's 1911 translation. Jenny Martins is on the piano, and it's conducted by Chris Pelly.
The shelter it offers so greet I the home, safe from dismay.
Whilst we have very few pictures from those 1911 performances, we do have some colourful descriptions of the actors and scenery from reviews. Walter Hyde played the part of Loga. His makeup was in accordance with tradition, but the whiteness of his face was carried so far that it became perilously near to reminding of the pantomime clown, and, while it should be pale, should be more in tone with his ruddy hair. John Coates' performance of Siegfried was said to leave an impression of remarkable boyishness, and this was aided by an admirable makeup. For once we had a young hero who did not seem to have come straight out of a hairdresser's window, but to have been brought up in the open with a ruddy complexion and crisp, curly hair. Alberic's transformation into a snake in Das Rhinegold was said to be much better planned than is commonly the case. Instead of wobbling across the stage in an unconvincing way, it extended its head from the back in a fashion which, though it reminded one of the vacuum cleaner poster, was effective enough to make Loga's terror accountable. And finally, the dragon was a sufficiently fearsome beast, but suffered, as so many stage effects do, from being overdone. His crimson eyes were so palpably electric lamps that they made the beast too obviously artificial, and the chance of making the creature impressive was lost. This was the more to be regretted, since it was otherwise a cleverly constructed dragon and conducted itself with unusual animation. Another oft-remarked element of the performances was the audience's behaviour. Whether it was because they were wrapped in the drama, or predominantly made up of wealthier patrons who wouldn't dare potentially offend their fellow audience members, it was noted that, unlike audiences for other theatre shows, there was no bawling of programmes, no jingling of bar glasses, no encores, applause in all the right places only, no hideous parade of advertisements on the curtain, and no putting on of hats and coats during the last 5 minutes. The Yorkshire Post's Herbert Thompson was always particularly dismissive of uneducated audiences, and even after the Ring Cycle's success, he was still amazed that Leeds had taken so strongly to the operas. That Leeds should be the first English provincial town to give the Ring of the Nibelung in its entirety strikes me as one of the best jokes I've met with for some time. There is, no doubt, a handful of genuine enthusiasts in the West Riding, but hardly sufficient of themselves to leaven the lump of materialism. No doubt this has been more than a Leeds undertaking. It has been made a county affair, and the fact that it has been so much talked about has attracted the most unlikely people, for the simple reason that they don't want to be out of it. But when one thinks of the enterprise of Leeds in matters artistic, its accidental prominence in this cast is certainly amusing. It's fair to say that he received his fair amount of negative letters to the editor in reply. Thompson, however, may have been to some degree vindicated by the future struggles of Den Hof to bring grand opera back to Leeds with the size of cast and orchestra that they'd enjoyed with the 1911 Ring Cycle. In 1912, Den Hof managed to corral enough support from audiences in Leeds, Hull, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow and Edinburgh to bring a new tour to these cities. Whilst it was said in the Yorkshire Post that only Edinburgh had shown as much support for this new tour as had Leeds, commanding a full house for 2 performances of Die Meistersinger and Electra, and 1 performance of Orpheus, Tristan and Isolde and the Flying Dutchman, was trickier than for the preceding year's Ring Cycle. In 1913, Den Hof once again attempted to tour the Ring Cycle, this time on an even wider scale, and despite the tour due to go ahead, just 2 weeks before opening night in Leeds on the 20th of October 1913, no one was revealing just how many tickets had been sold. Along with the Ring, Den Hof attempted an ambitious touring programme, also including Orpheus, Rosenkavalier and the Magic Flute, containing 200 performers, an orchestra of 82, 90 in the chorus and 24 ballet dancers, and finally, his ambitions got the better of him. The tour started in Birmingham, and having faced poor audiences in the city, it was already on its last legs when it arrived in Manchester. Den Hof abandoned the tour, unable to pay the week's wages, and it was only Sir Thomas Beecham racing up from London to take over that the tour was able to be completed. That sadly was the last time that Den Hof would try his hand again at theatrical producing. Audiences in Leeds had to wait a little while before seeing the Ring Cycle again. However, in both 1975 and 1976, English National Opera performed full cycles at Leeds Grand Theatre. We'd have to wait until 2016 for the next cycle, conducted by Richard Farnes. In a prescient review of the 1911 Ring Cycle performances in Manchester, the reviewer for the Musical Times wondered if they were to continue to enjoy performances of such ambition and scale outside of London, then perhaps we may someday be driven to a combination of cinematograph with singers and orchestra. A pretty accurate description of the 2016 Opera North Ring Cycle over 100 years later. I asked Richard what he thought the musical reputation of Leeds was today.
I think Leeds has got a fabulous reputation as a musical city. I mean, there's been a huge amateur scene in Yorkshire generally for a long time. And I think actually the presence of Opera North has certainly built on that. I think that big projects like this are there. They are civic projects in a sense. They enhance the sort of cultural status of the city itself. And one thing about Leeds is that people always say, well, it doesn't have its own symphony orchestra. Well, it does have its own professional symphony orchestra. The Opera North Orchestra is its professional orchestra. And I think that by performing these sort of works in the concert hall, that helps to enhance that fact, makes people more aware of the musical tradition in the city itself. And I think also the presence of buildings such as the town hall in Leeds, which have places of immense civic pride and are again very suitable for this type of repertoire, far more suitable from this, for instance, than Mozart. I think that also enhances the reputation of the city itself.
To end, let's briefly look at the history of opera at Leeds Grand Theatre, host of the 1911 Ring Cycle and home today of Opera North. As Leeds grew as a regional economic and cultural powerhouse in the 19th century, calls grew for the city to have a theatre befitting of its status. When Queen Victoria and Prince Albert visited Leeds in 1858, it was reported that the Prince said that Leeds seemed in need of a good theatre, and that nothing was more calculated to promote the culture and raise the tone of the people. Chaired by Sir Andrew Fairbairn, plans were developed to create a major theatre for the city of Leeds, one to rival the more established cultural destinations such as Manchester and Edinburgh. Over a 13-month build, costing between £60,000 and £70,000, Leeds Grand Theatre opened in 1878. Here we have details of the initial share offering made for the theatre, to raise funds for its creation and running costs. Whilst the facade of the theatre hasn't changed much in 150 years, there have been significant changes in the ways that audiences have used and moved around the building. For example, in 1878, there was much greater social division among audiences. Each level of the theatre had its own entrance, separating audiences based on seat and therefore cost of ticket. Circle patrons, for example, were served refreshments by attendants in kiosks, while everyone else had to make do with narrow slots in the walls, through which they squeezed one by one. There was, however, a transfer staircase inside the theatre, where you could pay extra to advance your seating and also your social position once you were inside. Leeds Grand Theatre opened with Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, and 1 week after opening night, opera was presented at the theatre for the first time. The renowned Carl Rosa Company had a full week of performances, with Verdi's Il Trovatore, the first opera performed at Leeds Grand Theatre. In 1958, there was a very special event at the theatre, when the Covent Garden Company visited Leeds as part of the Leeds Centenary Music Festival. In the audience for their performance of Samson by Handel was Queen Elizabeth II, and on the stage were two of the greatest singers of the 20th century, John Vickers and Joan Sutherland. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please consider making a donation, which you can do on the Leeds Opera Story website. We are a charity and rely on the generosity of our supporters and donors to carry out our work, so thank you for your support. To close this episode, here is soprano Catrin Woodruff with Let the Bright Seraphim from Handel's Samson, which audiences in Leeds heard performed by Joan Sutherland back in 1958.
Let the bright seraphim in blue, their loud